Hi, it's Pastor Andy with Wednesday's video this week, and we are moving towards the end of Romans. We are concluding Romans 14 this week. Next week we will get into Romans 15 and we'll do verses 1 through 13, and that will take us through really the application portion of the message that Paul was writing to the Romans, the application portion of this letter. So as we close Romans 14, I want to kind of tie this larger section of application together. The application portion starts in Romans chapter 12, after Paul had provided an extensive, although not full, it wasn't a fully articulated plan of salvation and everything. Most everything was there, but there were some things about like the end times and even there wasn't even a lot about the resurrection that is in those first 11 chapters, but it's a well-developed argument about faith in general. And so in Romans 12, 13 and 14, and the first part of Romans 15 then, Paul says, well, if that is what is true, if this is what God has done, if this is how we are to respond by faith, then how do we live out the faith that we choose, and how do we respond within that faith? Really, this kind of goes back to Romans chapter 4 even, where Paul writes about Abraham, and says that by faith, his faith was credited to him as righteousness. So this idea of faith leading us to righteousness, which goes back to the thesis verse for the entire book, Romans 1, 16 and 17, or the entire letter, and 17 saying that God manifested its righteousness for us, and so that we might live by faith. The righteous might live by faith. So the real issue that Paul is addressing in this portion of the letter is not necessarily about eating, or not necessarily about a day of worship per se. It was about love. And it is love that does two things for us, and we find it in this week's passage. I skipped over this on Sunday, but it's so important. That's why I wanted to spend a few minutes with it today. We see both of these ideas expressed in Romans 14:18. Let me read these words for us. Whoever thus serves Christ is acceptable to God and approved by men. Acceptable to God and approved by men. As I mentioned in some Sunday's sermon, it is difficult to say that we are serving Christ if we are being harmful to our Christian brothers and sisters. But when we show love, everyone benefits. God benefits because we're showing His love to others. We benefit because this says that we are acceptable to God, and mankind benefits because they receive the love from God through us, and we receive approval from mankind for love. But Paul's wording here is important for us to consider, because his wording about being acceptable to God isn't just something he's thrown in the middle of chapter 14. If we go back to the very first verse of the application portion in Romans, we hear these words. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. So here, which is your spiritual worship. So in Romans 12:1, Paul says, this is what you're aiming for. Be a sacrifice that is living, that is holy, and you'll find yourself acceptable to God. So how do we find ourselves acceptable to God? Well, near the end of this application section, Paul says, whoever thus serves Christ is acceptable to God. He returns to this idea here, and the dominant theme of Romans 12 through 14 is the single word, love. In Romans 12:3, Paul says that we are not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought. We are to consider others love. Romans 12:4 through 8 tells us that we are to be a functioning part of Christ's body, serving others as we serve Him, which, by the way, applies very well to Romans 14:18. And that serving and functioning as a part of Christ's body means that we are loving. Romans 12:9 says that our love is to be sincere, i.e., without hypocrisy. Romans 12 verses 10 through 13, and then verse 15 are about loving those who are a part of the faith. Romans 12, verse 14, and then 16 through 21 are about loving those who are not a part of the faith. Romans 13, 1 through 7 may be a little bit different because it talks about the government. However, the love theme is still on Paul's mind because he returns to it immediately in Romans 13, 8, and he carries it through to the end of Romans 13 and all the way through Romans 14 and into 15 in some manner, reminding us that love is the central command of God and showing that love should fully motivate us to live faithfully because the end is near, Romans 13, the latter part of Romans 13, and we need to help others to be prepared for the return of Jesus. And again, as we've seen these last few weeks, Romans 14, Paul exhorts both the strong and the weak not to judge one another. Instead, the strong are to exercise true freedom by not causing harm and imposing their faith on the weak. The weak, in turn, are not to judge the strong. Furthermore, both sides are to build up the other. They are to welcome each other, if for no other reason because Jesus welcomed us, as we'll see next week. Why? Love. We're going to talk more about that welcoming. And we're also going to see about how that has been a part of God's plan from the beginning. But for us, as we consider what Romans might mean, what this letter might mean for us today, we need to remember again that the thesis of this letter, Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, talk about that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation for all people, first the Jew, then the Gentile, and that God has manifested himself to us, manifest his righteousness to us, so that we might become righteous and live by faith. And as a part of that faith, as a part of our living by faith, we will live as God lives. And that is showing and sharing his love. Because when we love well, when we serve Christ, when we do those things, as Paul writes here, we will find ourselves acceptable to God and approved by men. And even if we're not approved by men, at least not in all circumstances, being acceptable to God is all that should really matter to us. So let us focus not on being right, but on applying love in all situations.